Hello, this is a video that I am making about suspension. Suspension is probably something you have heard of before because it's one of the parts that you can actually see on a vehicle, and it's kind of, I don't know, you probably just heard about it. I don't know how to explain that, but suspension is a simple, but it does a very important thing. Some people might think it's complicated, but I mean, it's pretty much just compressing something, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So probably what you do know about suspension is that it uses a spring. Springs are pretty simple, as that's pretty much the simplest part of suspension, is that it's a spring. So springs are, when you squish them, they push against, like, some springs are, you need to pull them apart. Some springs you can push them apart. Some pull towards the middle and some push away. And cars use the ones that push away because it wouldn't really make much sense to have it pull the car into the ground. So yeah, when cars use the springs that look pretty much like this, they're big, probably about this big around sometimes, and more like trucks use leaf springs. Leaf springs are just these big long things of metal that flex, and they push down, like, just against the thing, just same as a regular spring. It's just a different kind of concept. It's like if I took this marker, this thing can bend, but like if I had a wheel right here and just kind of pushed on it, it would kind of support something, whatever's pushing on top of it. It's providing a resistance between it's resisting the gravity of what's on top of it. And yeah, this would be a pretty strong thing for something like that for the scale. But anyway, now springs, you may guess, are a little bouncy. Like when you drop one, it just kind of bounces off the floor, and that is not really what you want with a car, because as you may have noticed when you drive a car or are riding in a car or see a car driving, cars do not bounce. You do not want a car to bounce, because suspension's job is to keep tires on the ground. That is so you can actually control the car, which is the second thing that suspension is meant to do. Suspension makes your car easier to drive. If you do not have suspension, then you better have a perfectly slick road, because if you didn't, it would be like, and that would be very, very uncomfortable. And that's the third thing suspension tries to do, is comfort the passengers. But if you like racing, that's not really what suspension is made to do. I mean, it does a little bit of that for the driver, but racing teams usually try to make their suspension for cornering faster. And if you're a Baja racer, then you handling big jumps and whoops. So more or less. And if you're a rally car racer, there will be different kinds of, not the same as like a Baja truck would take, but there are jumps where it's like more you jumping off a hill going at a high speed, and to absorb all the little bumps that there are, and to just handle the best it can on that terrain. For different terrains, different suspension movements are essential, because if you don't have a good one, then you're gonna be a terrible racer. So let's talk about how car springs do not bounce. So this is a shock. The shock has a piston in it, these are pretty much two test tubes. One is bigger than the other. The smaller one is on the bottom, and it kind of pushes up into the bigger one, and that creates pressure, which provides some of the resistance between the car bouncing. So that, yeah, this piston moves up and down. It is connected to the top. It moves down into this fluid that is the blue on here. The fluid provides the main resistance, which is called dampening. Dampening makes it so the car doesn't bounce. That's the whole point of a shock, is so that the car doesn't bounce. You can't have just shocks on your car, or else the car will just slowly fall to the ground, and then it won't come back up, which is what springs do. Springs push the car up, and these provide resistance going up and down. These just slow the movements, making the transition be smoother and not bounce when it reaches its the spring's max length. And so this piston has holes in it, like here. The shock fluid flows through the holes, and the reason it's holes and not just no piston at all, the reason there has to be a piston is so that it will actually have a resistance, or there won't really be any other than pressure, and that would not be enough. But if you had a piston that had no holes in it, it wouldn't really move that much. It would have a little bit, which would make really high pressure, and if you hit a big bump, it could possibly explode the shock, and that'd be expensive and really not even worth buying another one, because it's just going to do the same thing. But the reason when there's holes in it, it allows the fluid to flow through, and when it can do that, it can make it so the piston can move up and down. And when it can do that, this thing can go from this longer position to this position and back and forth, because the spring will constantly be pushing this bottom part down, and bumps, when you hit a bump, it'll push this bottom part up, and that's how a shock works. So when you combine the two, they kind of create what you see, because as you can see on cars, their suspension is not just a spring. It's got that big old tube in the middle, and that big tube in the middle is called a strut or a coilover. And coilover means coilover shock, so it's literally a spring over a shock. So this is just the top of the strut, and the spring kind of wraps around here, it pushes this part up and pushes the bottom part down. And this big rod going down the middle, that connects to the piston, as shown in the other picture. And this is the piston right here, and this is all the fluid. There's holes in the piston allowing fluid to flow through, and that dampens the movement of the shock. So the reason you want this is because it makes the ride a lot smoother, and makes the car's performance better. It makes everything just better. And so say you wanted smaller holes. Most suspension systems would just go for a stronger spring that pushes harder, because it's just easier, because you can get a shock and then just have change the spring on it to make it stronger, so it is stiffer. But say you shrunk those holes, that means the piston it would be harder for that fluid to flow through the piston, making it so that it can't move as easily. Like, it would just move slower, so the dampening would be harder. And if you had bigger holes, it would mean the shock could move really fast, really easily, and yeah. So, but you don't want to have too small ones, no matter what spring you have on it, because too big of holes no matter what spring you have on it, because if you had too big of holes, then it would pretty much end up being like the just plain spring. It would be a little bit better, but it would still be bad. And if you had too small of them with the spring, it would just be really hard to move and be a really bad ride. Now let's talk about what different types of things you would want for different types of racing. For road cars, for just like your daily driver, you have really soft suspension compared to those that race on tracks, because this makes the ride smoother and more comfortable. And for the ones on tracks, you want stiffer suspension, because when you accelerate, the car will squat in the back. You can probably tell if you stomp the accelerator in your regular car, that the car would lean back, and when it leans back, it's harder to control. And when you stomp on the brakes, you lean forward, and when you lean forward, it is also harder to control. And in a race car, they stiffen that up to minimize it, and they still have some softness, because they can't just have this solid brick going around the track, because if you had just welded suspension, that'd be no suspension movement, and some stuff would probably break, it's fair to say. And yeah, and in a rally cars undergo much different stuff than what road race cars undergo, because rally cars, they drive on dirt tracks, and when you drive on a dirt track, there are bumps that go up and kind of little potholes that go down. You can see those, I guess, on road tracks, but they're way less common. On rally tracks, they are expected. It's not a rally race if you don't have them, I think, at least in my opinion, unless it's a gravel road and they're just kind of covered. But yes, they are. When there is a pothole, you don't want to have the suspension to just be completely jacked up all the way, because if it's jacked up all the way, then that means the wheel cannot go down any more than it is at already. And that means if I were to go over a bump with this, with my suspension being this high, and it's completely just as high as can be, it'll just go right over it, and the tire will lose contact with the road if you're going fast enough. And if you're going slow, then you're gonna go and hit the bump really hard, and it's probably not gonna sound very good for your beloved car. And yeah, that's pretty much the whole problem with having too tight of suspension. But if you have too loose a suspension, then your car will go over the bumps normally. It'll sit a lot lower, and it'll just kind of go over a bump and absorb it. But if you are going over a bump that is going up, then the suspension won't have hardly any room to load that in that bump, and it will just kind of make the shock bottom out. It will just hit it, just completely compress itself and probably break it, because some parts aren't meant it's not really meant to collapse that much. And then it will kind of also shock your car pretty much the same way, except it'll be launching you up, and the other having it be completely out would make it just kind of go and just kind of dive and jump back up. You want to have a balance of both of them, because you just gotta find the best of both worlds. The tire on the car needs to be able to, when it encounters a bump, it needs to be able to go into the bump and come back out without losing contact with the road. which is mostly experienced by rally racers, and that's mostly what you know about that. And for big trucks like Baja racers at the Baja 1000, there are whoops, which is kind of just a new kind of bump if you've only been in a car before and not really gone in the desert. The whoops are just repeated bumps that the suspension needs to constantly adjust to, and like when you watch a Baja truck race, its suspension's going like, just the front tires will be going up and down constantly over whoops, and it needs to be able to go over big bumps. Like, it just needs to have more suspension travel, because cars will have like this much, Baja trucks will need to have like this much, like probably 2 to 3 times as much possibly, and they need to be soft enough to absorb big bumps without just launching the truck when you go over it, and it needs to be stiff enough to be able to hold the truck over it, or it's just gonna break the whole thing. That is pretty much how I'm gonna wrap this up, and right after this, it is a video of me replacing the shocks in my car, which is a 2013 Impala. Yeah, it's not an exciting car, I know. It's just it's a car. It works as a 3.6 with 300 horsepower, so I mean, that's all right for a first car. It has paddle shifters that are crappy, but they work kinda. So yes, enjoy watching the end of that when I change the shocks on the time lapse. So bye-bye.